Ledger was open. That was the first thing Dante Castellano saw when he stepped through the doorway of his study. The one room in the entire mansion, in the entire city, where no one entered without being summoned, where no one breathed without permission, where grown men had stood trembling and left with their futures rearranged. The ledger was open, its dark green cover splayed wide like two wings, and the pages, those pages filled with a compressed, careful handwriting that represented 20 years of sins organized into columns, were exposed to the afternoon light streaming through the window. The second thing he saw was her. She was 4 years old. She was standing on his chair. She had somehow climbed up onto his mahogany desk, the desk that his lawyer approached with visible nervousness, that his lieutenant stood 3 feet back from out of instinct, and she was standing there in her small yellow dress with the little white daisies along the hem, her dark curls escaping from 2 uneven pigtails, and she was turning the pages of his ledger with a focused, serious expression of a child who believes she is doing something very important. She was humming. Dante Castellano, the man who had made police commissioners cry, who had sat across negotiating tables from men with armies behind them and never once blinked, stood in the doorway of his own study and could not move. The little girl looked up. Her eyes were enormous, brown as warm earth, fringed with thick lashes, and they held the kind of absolute fearlessness that only exists in people who are too young to have learned yet what fear is for. She looked at him the way children look at strangers, with open assessment, no pretense, no calculation.
Just pure seeing.
"Pretty book," she said. Then she turned another page. Dante opened his mouth. He was not sure what was supposed to come out. A command, a shout, the particular controlled fury he deployed so precisely when things moved without his permission. But nothing came. Something was happening in his chest that he had no vocabulary for. Something that felt, bewilderingly, like the air going out of a room. Then he heard the footsteps, frantic, stumbling, breathless, and Elena Vasquez appeared behind him in the corridor, and the sound that came from her throat when she saw her daughter standing on Dante Castellano's desk with his ledger open in her small hands was the sound of a woman who believed, in that precise moment, that she was watching her own death arrive. "Sofia." Elena's voice came out barely above a whisper, but it carried everything. Terror.
Love.
The particular anguish of a mother who sees catastrophe and cannot reach it in time. "Sofia, come here. Come here right now." Sofia looked at her mother with mild curiosity. "Mama, pretty book," she said, holding up the ledger helpfully. A page slipped free slightly from the binding, one single loose page, covered in names and numbers, and drifted, slowly, to the floor beside the desk. Elena made a sound like something breaking inside her. She crossed the room in 3 steps, lifted her daughter from the desk with shaking arms, pressed the child's face into her shoulder, and turned to face Dante Castellano. Her eyes were wet. Her whole body was shaking so visibly that Sofia, alarmed by it, had stopped humming and was patting her mother's cheek with one small hand and saying, "Mama? Mama, okay?" Dante looked at the child patting her terrified mother's face. He looked at the open ledger on his desk. He looked at the loose page on the floor, and before he could stop himself, before the careful, controlled, armored version of himself could intercept the action, his eyes dropped to the page and found, in his own handwriting, 3 words and a name that he had not thought about in years. Vasquez. Settled. Demolished. The color left his face. Not gradually. Not the slow fade of a man growing uncomfortable. It left all at once, like a light being switched off, like a tide pulling back from a shore with sudden, violent speed. Elena saw it happen, saw the iron certainty drain from those gray eyes and be replaced by something she had never expected to see there, had never imagined she would see on the face of a man like this, and did not have an immediate name for. Later, alone in the dark of her small room with Sofia sleeping warm and heavy against her side, she would find the name for it. She had watched Dante Castellano look at that page and recognize, perhaps for the first time, what the word demolished actually weighed when it was attached to a human name. She had watched him feel it. The study was utterly silent. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a bird was singing. Sofia had stopped patting Elena's cheek and had turned to look at the big, quiet man in the doorway with those enormous brown eyes, studying him with the solemn, unfiltered attention of a child who doesn't yet know she is supposed to look away. "Man sad?" Sofia asked. Nobody answered her. But the question filled the room like smoke, like water rising, like something that had been locked in the walls for 20 years finally finding a crack to seep through. And Dante Castellano, the most feared man in the city, stood in the doorway of the room where all his sins lived on paper, exposed by a child who couldn't yet read the words and did not move and did not speak, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, did not know what to do next. Elena Vasquez had been 5 years old when everything ended. She did not remember the before time in precise images so much as in sensations. The smell of her father's bakery in the early morning, yeast and sugar, and the warmth of ovens that had been lit since 4 in the morning, the particular golden light that came through the front windows at 7 when the first customers arrived, the sound of her mother's voice calling to her father from the back room in a tone that was warm and teasing, and full of the ease of people who are safe. She remembered sitting on the bakery counter, while her father let her press her small thumb into the center of a roll before it went into the oven. She remembered the way he laughed, big and unguarded, the laugh of a man who owned something and loved it and had no reason to fear losing it. The Vasquez family had run that bakery for 2 generations. Her grandfather had built it from nothing, had worked every day of his adult life to make it into something real and lasting, and had passed it to Elena's father with the particular gravity of a man handing over the most important thing he owned. The bakery sat on the corner of a street in what had once been a modest but lively neighborhood, not wealthy but breathing, full of small businesses and families who knew each other's names, a neighborhood that had its own particular texture and sound and smell. Then Dante Castellano decided he needed that street. Elena had learned this piece of information slowly, over years, in fragments that her mother let fall in moments of exhausted grief, and that Elena had assembled quietly in the privacy of her own mind, the way you assemble a picture that you're not sure you want to see. A developer had wanted to build. The developer needed certain people to leave. Certain people had not wanted to leave. And so certain arrangements had been made, the kind of arrangements that never appear in any legal document, that exist only in private conversations and in the pages of a dark green ledger on a mahogany desk. Her father had been visited 3 times. The first visit was polite. The second visit was not. The third visit lasted 45 minutes, and afterward her father came home and sat at the kitchen table and did not move for 6 hours. He would not tell her mother what was said.
He did not need to.
3 weeks later, he signed the papers. 50% of what the property was worth, paid in a lump sum that had conditions attached to it like barbed wire, conditions that meant the money could not be used to start over anywhere nearby, could not be used to open a competing business, could barely be used at all without triggering penalties that a family without lawyers would not have understood until it was too late. The bakery was demolished 6 months later. Elena remembered standing on the pavement across the street with her mother, watching the machines work, and feeling the absence of the building as a physical thing, a hollow in her own chest that the cold air moved through. Her mother cried silently with her hands folded in front of her, like she was praying. Her father did not come. He had not been able to bring himself to watch. He never recovered. This was the truth that Elena's family did not say aloud but lived with every day for the rest of his life. Not dramatically. He didn't collapse, didn't disappear, but the man who had laughed unguardedly and let his daughter press her thumb into bread dough was simply gone, replaced by a quieter, diminished version of himself who moved through his days with the particular care of someone who has learned that things can be taken and has never found a way to stop expecting it to happen again. He worked whatever jobs he could find. He was reliable and sober and responsible and entirely, heartbreakingly hollowed out. He died when Elena was 19, and the doctor said it was his heart, and Elena knew that was true in more ways than medicine could measure. Her mother lasted 2 more years. Elena had been 21, pregnant and alone, and possessed of exactly $300 and a garbage bag of clothes, when a woman from a domestic staffing agency had placed her in the Castellano mansion. She had not known, the agency had not told her, and she had not been in a position to investigate because you do not investigate when you are 21 and pregnant and have $300. She had arrived with her small bag and her large belly and been shown to the servants' wing by a housekeeper who barely looked at her, and she had worked with the particular invisible efficiency of someone who needs the job too badly to risk being seen. She had been there 4 years. She had understood almost immediately, from whispered conversations between other staff, from the particular weight of silence in certain rooms, from the way visitors arrived and left, and the way her employer's name sat in the air even when he wasn't present, exactly what kind of household she was in. And she had pressed this knowledge down beneath the waterline of her daily existence and continued to work because Sofia needed food and warmth and safety, and those things required money, and money required the job. She had never, in 4 years, connected the name Castellano to the story of her father's bakery. This is not as strange as it might seem. She had been 5 when it happened. The name that had moved through her childhood in fragments and whispers was not a name she had seen on paper. It was a shape of fear without a face, a force without a title. She had grown up knowing that something had taken everything from her family, but the specific name of the thing had been protected from her, the way you protect children from the precise shape of the monster under the bed, even as you acknowledge that something frightening is there. Now she stood in Dante Castellano's study with her daughter pressed to her shoulder and her body shaking, watching him look at that loose page on the floor, watching the blood leave his face, and she did not yet know why. She did not yet know what was written on that page. She only knew that something had shifted in the room, something fundamental, like a wall that has looked solid for years developing a crack that runs all the way to the foundation. Sofia was still watching Dante with those enormous eyes. "Man," she said, gently, reaching one small hand in his direction from her mother's arms as though she could offer him something, comfort, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that she saw him standing there, that he was real, that she was not afraid of him. Elena pressed her daughter's hand gently down and waited for the world to end. Esquez. Settled. Demolished. Dante could not stop seeing it. He had moved, eventually, had walked to the desk with the deliberate, measured steps of a man who is maintaining his composure through sheer force of will, and had picked up the loose page from the floor without letting his hand tremble. He had set it back inside the ledger and closed the cover with the quiet finality that he usually associated with decisions, with endings, with the shutting of doors. He had done all of this with Elena and Sofia still in the room, and they had stood together in perfect stillness, the mother and the child, watching him, and the silence was so complete that he could hear Sofia breathing. He had not looked at Elena while he closed the ledger. He had not been able to. "You can go," he'd said. His voice had come out wrong, not in the way it was wrong when he was angry, which was a particular controlled flatness that everyone in his household recognized and feared. Wrong in a different way, quieter, less certain. The voice of a man who has heard something inside himself and is trying to determine whether it was real. Elena had left. Of course, she had left. She had turned and walked out of that room with Sofia on her hip, and she had not run, because running would have broken her dignity, and her dignity was perhaps the only thing in this household that belonged exclusively to her, and Dante had stood in the center of his study and listened to her footsteps recede down the corridor, and then listened to the silence that came after. He had stood there for a long time. The ledger sat on the desk, and he looked at it the way he imagined a man might look at something he'd kept in a box for 20 years, something he'd convinced himself was contained and manageable and sealed, and then the box had been opened. Not by him, not by an enemy, not by anyone who understood what they were doing, but by a 4-year-old girl in a yellow dress who had simply walked in and turned the pages and found it pretty. He was 40 years old. He had ordered things to be done in the world that had altered the landscape of hundreds of lives, and he had justified each one at the time with the efficient, forward-moving logic of a man who understands that every decision has collateral and who has trained himself to keep his eyes on the transaction and not on the collateral. This was the discipline of his life. This was what made him effective. You could not do what he did and also feel every piece of it. You could not hold the weight of every name in that ledger and continue to function. He understood this. He had always understood this. But the thing about a 4-year-old girl standing on your desk and turning the pages of your sins and calling them pretty, the thing about looking up from the word demolished and finding a child looking back at you with eyes that contain no judgment because they don't yet know what judgment is, was that it didn't give you the option of the transaction. It didn't allow you to stay behind the glass. It reached through every wall you'd built, and every word you'd used to rationalize, and every year that had passed and turned to distance, and it put the ledger on the desk and the name on the page and the child in the room all at the same time, and it said, "Look, really look." He sat down in his chair, the chair Sofia had climbed, the chair that still held the small warmth of her, and he opened the ledger again. He turned to the entry. Vasquez. Settled. Demolished. Below it, the dollar amount, pitifully small in the context of everything that followed. Below that, a date, 20 years ago in spring. He had been 20 years old himself. He had been proving himself to his father, learning the geometry of power, making himself useful in ways that would be remembered. The Vasquez bakery had been, to him at that time, an obstacle on a spreadsheet. A line item. A problem that required a solution. He tried to remember the family. He could not. This was perhaps the most devastating thing. Not that he remembered and had chosen to proceed anyway, but that the obliteration of someone's entire world had left such a shallow trace in him. A notation in a ledger. 3 words. Vasquez. Settled.
Demolished.
He thought about Elena. He thought about her age, 25, and did the mathematics he'd been too proud to do before, the mathematics that now arranged themselves in front of him with the quiet, inexorable logic of something he could not unknow. She had been 5 years old. She had been 5 years old when his notation was made, when his solution was implemented, when the demolition crews arrived and took away whatever that family had built. She had been a child exactly older than her own daughter was right now. He pressed his hand flat against the page. He was not a man who prayed. He was not a man who apologized. He was not a man who sat with discomfort and let it expand and breathe and teach him things about himself, because those were luxuries of softer lives, and he had not built what he built by indulging softness. But Sofia's small face was in front of him, those enormous brown eyes, man sad, one small hand reaching toward him, and he found that he could not assemble the usual defenses, could not find the right argument, the right distance, the right way to close the box back up and step away from it. He sat in his chair and he felt, with a rawness that was almost physical, the full and terrible weight of what 3 words and a dollar amount had actually meant to a real family in the real world. He felt like he was 20 years old again, and also like he was very, very old. Outside, the afternoon had deepened toward evening. The garden went from gold to gray. The bird had stopped singing. The city lights were beginning to come on in the distance, and Dante sat with his hand on the page and the page under his hand, and the past pressing up through the paper like water through stone, slow and steady and utterly unstoppable, and for the first time in the memory of anyone who had ever known him, Dante Castellano did not know how to be the most powerful person in the room. The most powerful person in the room, it turned out, had been 4 years old, in a yellow dress, and she was gone. Elena did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in her room in the servants' wing with Sofia curled against her, warm and heavy and smelling of the lavender soap Elena used for her bath, and she stared at the ceiling and she waited. This was what you did when you worked in a household like this and something had gone wrong. You waited. You did not run, because running confirmed guilt and drew attention, and you had nowhere to go. You did not confront, because confrontation required a position of power that you did not possess. You simply existed in the space between the thing that had happened and the consequence that was surely coming, and you breathed very carefully, and you did not let yourself think about the future in specific terms because the future might be terrible and specific thoughts made it more real. Sofia slept with one hand curled under her chin and her mouth slightly open, and Elena watched her breathe and felt the familiar combination of absolute love and absolute terror that was the permanent condition of being a mother with no safety net. Everything she did for this child. Every morning she woke and made herself invisible and efficient and useful was a morning she was paying, in the only currency she had, for Sofia's safety and warmth and the continuation of a life that was small but intact. She had worked so hard to keep things intact. She thought about the way the color had left Dante Castellano's face. She had been too frightened in the moment to fully process it, but now, in the dark, with Sofia breathing beside her, she replayed it, the image of that gray emptying from those gray eyes, the particular quality of stillness that had overtaken a man she had only ever seen in motion, in control, in the armored certainty of absolute authority. She had expected rage. She had prepared herself for rage, had already begun composing, in the frantic back of her mind, the apology she would have to deliver, the explanation that Sofia had slipped away while she was cleaning the upper hallway, that it had been 30 seconds, she had followed immediately, it would never happen again. But there had been no rage. There had been something so much stranger and so much harder to read that she had not been able to name it then, and was still struggling to name it now. He had looked at that page on the floor, and something had happened inside him that was visible from the outside, which was extraordinary in itself, because Dante Castellano was a man who had carefully and comprehensively eliminated the visible from himself. He had looked at that page the way you look at something that tells you something about yourself that you were not prepared to know. She did not understand it. She did not understand it yet. At 6 in the morning, when the house was just beginning to stir with the quiet sounds of the early staff, she rose and dressed and carried Sofia to the small supervised playroom where the housekeeper's granddaughter sometimes kept children occupied during working hours. She kissed Sofia on both cheeks and on the top of her head and held her one extra moment longer than usual, and Sofia patted her face and said, "Mama, go work," with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who has always understood that mornings mean separation, and Elena set her down and walked away down the corridor and did not let herself look back. She went to work. She cleaned. She moved through the rooms of the mansion with her cart and her cloths and her quiet efficiency, and she avoided the second floor, avoided the corridor that led to the study, and she told herself that ordinary things were happening in ordinary time and that she would handle whatever came when it arrived. It arrived at 10 in the morning. Marco, Dante's assistant, a thin, precise man of indeterminate age who had worked for the Castellano family for 15 years and who communicated almost exclusively in the language of neutral facial expressions and carefully worded sentences, appeared at the end of the corridor where Elena was cleaning and told her, in a voice that revealed nothing, that Mr. Castellano wished to speak with her. Elena put down her cloth. She thought about Sofia in the playroom, sitting on the floor with her legs crossed, probably making something out of the colored blocks that she would present later with enormous pride. She thought about her mother's hands folded in front of the demolished bakery. She thought about the $300 in a bag and the agency, and the moment she had arrived at these gates, not knowing what name she was walking toward. She followed Marco down the corridor and up the stairs. She stood outside the study door, and Marco knocked twice and opened it and stood aside, and Elena walked in. The room was quiet. The morning light was thin and gray through the large window. The fire was burning low. Dante was standing, not behind the desk, not in the position of authority, but at the window, with his back to her, looking out at the garden. He was wearing a dark gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up, and his hands were in his pockets, and he looked, from behind, like a man who had been standing there for a long time. He did not hear her come in. Or perhaps he heard her and did not turn. Either way, Elena stood in the center of the room and waited, and the ledger sat on the desk where it always sat, closed now, ordinary-looking, betraying nothing. "Mrs. Vasquez," he said finally, still looking out the window. "Yes," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of this. There was a long pause, long enough that the low fire popped and settled, long enough that a cloud passed across the pale winter sun, and the room dimmed briefly and brightened again. "Your daughter is well?" he said. This was so far from anything she had expected that for a moment she did not process the words. "Yes," she said then.
She is. Yes.
"She's well." Another pause. "Good," he said. He still had not turned around. And Elena stood in the center of the room with her heart hammering and her hands very still at her sides and waited for the axe, because this quiet, this careful, this back-turned formality was surely the shape that axes took in this household, the particular prelude to something devastating delivered from a safe distance. She waited. He said nothing else. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the garden, impossibly, the bird from yesterday was singing again. He turned around. Elena had prepared herself for many things in the long hours of the night, but she had not prepared herself for his face. She had not prepared herself for the absence of the usual architecture, the careful arrangement of authority and distance that Dante Castellano wore on his face the way other men wore watches, as a signal, a statement, a reminder of where the lines of power ran. It was not there. In its place was something that looked, shockingly, like exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, but the deeper, structural exhaustion of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just now noticed that his arms have given out. His eyes, those pale gray eyes that people described as cold and that Elena had always privately described as absent, were not absent now. They were present in a way that was almost uncomfortable, the way a room is uncomfortable when all the furniture has been removed and there is nothing left to look at except the walls themselves. He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them, on the desk, the ledger sat in its ordinary silence. "Your family name," he said. "Vasquez."
He paused.
There was a bakery. The floor shifted under her. Not physically, nothing physical moved, but something in the architecture of her understanding of this moment, of this room, of this man and herself and the 4 years she had spent in this house, shifted with a completeness and a totality that made her reach, without thinking, for the back of the chair nearest to her. He watched her reach for the chair. He did not look away. "There was a bakery," she said. The words came out barely above a whisper. "On the corner of," he said the street name. She closed her eyes. She was 5 years old. She could smell the yeast and the sugar and the warmth of the ovens. She could feel her father's hands lifting her onto the counter and the soft pressure of bread dough under her thumb. "Yes," she said. The single syllable cost her something she could not have quantified. Dante moved from the window. He did not go to the desk. He went to the chair on the near side of it, the chair that visitors sat in, and he sat down in it slowly, as though the act of sitting was something that required deliberate choice, as though he was putting himself in a position he did not usually occupy. He folded his hands on his knees, and he looked at the floor between them, and then he looked up at her. And what was on his face? Elena would carry this image for the rest of her life, would take it out sometimes in quiet moments and turn it over and examine it from different sides. What was on his face was the particular expression of a man who has just understood, fully and finally, and without any remaining distance, the exact dimensions of the damage he has done. "I was 20 years old," he said. "I don't say that as a reason. I say it because it's true, and because I think you deserve the truth more than you deserve an organized offense." Elena said nothing. Her hand was still on the back of the chair. She could feel the carved wood under her fingers, the specific texture of it, the solidity of it, and she held on. "I had a list of properties," Dante continued, and his voice was measured, but underneath the measure was something unsteady, something she recognized because she heard it sometimes in her own voice when she talked about her father. "Your family's property was on the list. It was an obstacle. That's how I thought about it, an obstacle. I was learning how these things worked. I was proving something.
He stopped.
Pressed his lips together. Your father came to the table twice before he stopped resisting. I had people convince him that resisting was the worst choice. And he signed. Elena's throat was so tight it hurt. I wrote 3 words in the ledger, Dante said. Vasquez. Settled. Demolished. And then I moved to the next item on the list. He paused. 20 years ago. And yesterday your daughter. He stopped again. Something moved across his face that she could not fully name. Grief, perhaps, or its cousin. Something that recognized loss without having a right to claim it. Your daughter stood on this desk and opened that book, and I walked in and I saw her standing there and I saw the page and He stopped for the 3rd time, and this stop was different from the others. This one was longer. This one had weight. I saw the name, he said finally, and I looked up, and there she was, looking at me. He was quiet. The fire crackled. I don't know what your life has been, he said.
After.
I know what the transaction was. I know the number. I don't know, he paused. A child who is 5 years old, he said. A father. A mother. A business that had existed for 2 generations. He looked at his hands. I didn't think about those things. I trained myself not to think about those things. It made everything easier. Elena looked at him. She was shaking. She could feel it in her legs, in the hand holding the chair, but her voice when she finally found it was steady in the way that water under ice is steady, something moving forcefully beneath the surface that looked still. My father died at 58, she said. He never rebuilt. He never, she stopped. Pressed the back of her free hand to her mouth for one moment. Lowered it. He was a baker. That was the whole of who he was. You didn't just take the building. You took the thing he was made of. And he spent the rest of his life being a smaller version of himself and trying not to let us see it. Dante Castellano did not look away from her. He received what she was saying without flinching, without defense, without any of the insulating mechanisms of power, and this too she would remember. The way he sat in the visitor's chair in his own study and let her words reach him without armor. I know, he said. These were, perhaps, the 2 most devastating words she had ever heard from this man, because they were not a defense and not a denial. They were acknowledgement. Raw, unpolished, costly acknowledgement from a man who had spent 40 years building an empire on the currency of never having to acknowledge anything. The morning light moved through the window. The fire had gone to embers. And 2 people sat in a room together with 20 years of damage between them, and neither of them looked away. It was Sofia who ended the silence. Elena had gone to collect her from the playroom at noon, had walked the long way around, back through the servants' wing, her mind moving through what had happened in the study with the slow, stunned movement of someone picking through wreckage, trying to identify what was salvageable. Her body felt strange. Too light, and also impossibly heavy. Like something had been lifted from her without her permission, and also something had been placed on her that she had not asked to carry. She did not know what to feel. 20 years of a wound she hadn't been able to name had been given its name this morning in a room she had feared, by a man she had feared, and the naming of it was supposed to feel like something, closure, perhaps, or justice, or the particular cold satisfaction of being right about the shape of the thing that hurt you. But instead it felt like standing in an open field with no walls anywhere and the wind coming from all directions at once. Sofia was sitting in the playroom with a construction of colored blocks in front of her that she had apparently been building for 2 hours and that had reached a height that seemed structurally ambitious for a 4-year-old. Mama, look, Sofia said, without looking up. I builded it very tall. You did, Elena said. You built it very tall. It didn't fall, Sofia said, with the particular satisfaction of a child who has defied expectations. Elena sat down on the playroom floor beside her daughter, regardless of her uniform, regardless of the practicalities, and she pulled Sofia into her lap and wrapped her arms around her and pressed her face into those dark curls and breathed her in. That warm child smell of lavender and biscuits and something indefinably Sofia, and she held her tightly enough that Sofia said, "Mama," squeezing, but then relaxed into it with the animal trust of a loved child. "It's okay," Elena said, to Sofia and also to herself. "We're okay." What she did not know, what she would only find out later from Marco, who had the particular quality of the long-serving employee who knows everything and reveals things only at the precise moment they will do the most good, was that Dante had asked, that morning before she arrived at his study, to see the full file that the staffing agency maintained on Elena. He had read it. He had read the intake form that Elena had filled out 4 years ago, her age at the time, 21, her situation, single and expecting, her previous employment, 2 years at a restaurant and 1 year at a cleaning company, her next of kin none. He had read the form that had been filled out by the social services worker who had visited the servants' wing when Sofia was born, assessing Elena's fitness as a mother in a household of ambiguous safety, who had noted that Mrs. Vasquez was clearly devoted to her child and clearly managing an extremely difficult situation with admirable composure. He had read a one-line note at the bottom of this form, added by the worker almost as an afterthought. Subject has experienced significant family losses. Father deceased, mother deceased. No support network. Resilient but isolated. He had sat with this file for an hour before sending Marco to find Elena. And then, and this was the part that Marco told her later, in the quiet, careful way that Marco told things, after she had left to study, after the morning had ended and the afternoon had come and gone, Dante had gone to the playroom himself. He had stood in the doorway. Sofia had been alone by then, the housekeeper's granddaughter having gone to lunch, and she had been sitting with her blocks, and she had looked up at the doorway and seen the big quiet man from yesterday, the one who had been sad, and she had considered him for a moment with those enormous eyes. Then she had picked up a blue block and held it out toward him. "You can have one," she said, with the generosity of someone offering their most precious possession. Building is more fun with 2 people. Marco had told Elena that he had watched Dante Castellano stand in the doorway of the playroom for 15 seconds, which might not sound long but was, for a man like that, in a moment like that, an eternity. And then he had walked into the room and lowered himself to the floor, with the careful, deliberate movements of a large man in a small space, and he had taken the blue block from Sofia's outstretched hand. "You build it," Sofia had told him seriously. "But I say where." "All right," Dante had said. And they had built together for 20 minutes, the 4-year-old dictating the placement of each block with absolute authority, the most feared man in the city following instructions. And when Sofia's tower finally fell, which it eventually did with a spectacular and satisfying crash, Sofia had thrown both arms into the air and shouted. Again, with the unqualified joy of someone for whom the falling is not a failure, but a beginning. When Elena heard this story, she sat for a long time in the quiet of her room with it. She thought about a child who had walked into a room full of secrets and had not been frightened because she had not yet learned what secrets were. Who had found a book full of sins and called it pretty because she could not read the words and so saw only the shapes, and the shapes were interesting. Who had held out a blue block to the man who had taken everything from her family and said, simply, "Building is more fun with 2 people." Sofia had not forgiven Dante Castellano. You cannot forgive what you do not know. But she had done something that was in some ways harder and more radical than forgiveness. She had simply, without agenda or calculation, treated him as a person. As someone who was present in the room with her. As someone who might want a blue block. Elena thought about her father. She thought about his hands on the bread dough and his laugh and the way the ovens lit the bakery golden in the early morning, and the way he had sat at the kitchen table for 6 hours without moving, and the way he had grown quieter and smaller and then gone entirely. She thought about 20 years of carrying the shape of something that had hurt her family without being able to name the force behind it. She thought about a dark green ledger and 3 words and a man with gray eyes sitting in the visitor's chair in his own study saying, "I know." She did not know what any of it meant for the future. She did not know what you do with the geography of a wound once it has been given a name and an address. She did not know if understanding was the same as healing, or if it was just understanding, smaller, humbler, but perhaps also necessary as a beginning. She knew that Sofia had built something today that hadn't fallen, and that when it did fall, she had not been devastated but delighted, and had immediately wanted to begin again. She held this thought carefully, like bread dough, pressing her thumb into the center of it, feeling it give. 3 weeks passed. Life in the mansion continued in its patterns, the cleaning and the cooking, the arrivals and departures, the late-night meetings behind closed doors, the telephone calls that ended abruptly when staff walked into rooms. Dante continued to be Dante, exacting, controlled, feared in the way that tectonic plates are feared, not because of what they do every day, but because of what they are capable of. The machinery of his world continued to turn. But things had shifted. Subtly, in ways that could not be pointed to directly. The way a room is subtly different after someone has moved a single piece of furniture, not enough to name, but enough to feel when you walk into it. He stopped locking his study when he worked. This was in the context of everything a small thing. But in the Castellano mansion, where the study lock had been engaged with religious consistency for 15 years, where the habit of the lock was understood by every member of staff to be as fundamental and non-negotiable as the walls themselves, it was noticed. Marco noticed it. The housekeeper noticed it. Elena noticed it, and she understood something about it that the others perhaps did not. That a man who has spent 20 years behind armor does not remove it all at once, but begins with a single small gesture, a single door left slightly open, and waits to see what happens next. He began eating dinner at an earlier hour, and sometimes, when Elena passed the dining room with her cart, she would hear something unexpected. The housekeeper's granddaughter's voice, and then Sofia's, and then beneath both of them, the low register of a man's voice asking a question and listening to the answer. She learned later that he had, without announcement or explanation, begun having the children eat in the formal dining room on Tuesday evenings instead of the servants' kitchen. The housekeeper had been bewildered. Sofia had been delighted and had immediately begun treating this as a permanent arrangement and had started requesting specific foods, which Marco reported Dante had actually attempted to accommodate. One Tuesday evening, Elena passed the dining room and heard Sofia's voice saying, very seriously, "You have to try it with the butter and the honey, not just one. You have to do both." She heard Dante's voice say, "Both seems excessive." "It's not excessive," Sofia said, with the uncompromising authority of a 4-year-old who is absolutely certain of something. "It's how bread is supposed to be." There was a pause. Then, all right. Both. Elena stood in the corridor outside the closed door and pressed her hand flat against the wood and closed her eyes. Butter and honey. Her father had put butter and honey on bread. He had done it every Sunday morning, had made a ceremony of it, had called it the only truly correct way to eat bread, and had laughed at anyone who disagreed. She had not thought about this in years. She had not known she remembered it. She stood there for a long moment. Then she took her hand from the door and walked on. The formal reckoning, if it deserved that word, if it was that organized, came at the end of the 3rd week. Dante asked her to come to the study again. She went without the fear of the first time, but with a different kind of weight. The weight of anticipation, of not knowing what shape this conversation would take or what it would require of her. He had an envelope on the desk. He pushed it toward her and said, "This is not something I expect you to accept because of where we are. I want that to be clear. You are not obligated, and declining has no consequences." She opened the envelope. Inside was a document. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading. The language was legal and careful, and she was not familiar with this type of document. But gradually the shape of it emerged, a property transfer. A small commercial space on a street she recognized. Not the old street, not the impossible return, but a street nearby, a good street, a street with foot traffic, and a neighborhood with the texture of a place that was alive. The space had been, the document noted, a bakery some years before. It was currently empty. She looked up from the document. "There's an account," Dante said. He pushed a second sheet across the desk. "Sufficient to renovate and stock. To run for the first 2 years without pressure." She stared at him. "Why?" she said, and the word came out stripped of everything. Just the bare question. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands the way he had looked at them 3 weeks ago, and then he looked up. "Because 3 words in a ledger were not a transaction," he said. "They were a life. Your father's life. Your mother's. Yours. And I wrote them as though they were a line item, and I moved on, and I built more, and I wrote more, and I told myself this was simply how things work." He paused. "Your daughter stood on my desk and called my ledger pretty, and she looked at me with eyes that did not know I was supposed to be feared, and I understood, in that moment, that I had been living inside a story I had written myself to make what I did bearable. And the story was," he stopped. "Not true," he said finally. "It was not true." Elena looked at the document. She looked at the account balance on the second sheet. She thought about bread dough and her father's laugh and butter and honey and 2 generations of something real and lasting that had been reduced to 3 words. She thought about what it means to rebuild, whether you can, whether the thing rebuilt is the same thing or something new, whether something new is a betrayal or a continuation. She thought about Sofia saying it didn't fall, and again, and building is more fun with 2 people. "I can't forgive you," she said. She said it clearly, without hostility, not as a cruelty but as a truth, because he had given her honesty and she owed him the same. "Not today. I don't know if I can. What happened to my father? What it took from him? I don't think that's mine to forgive on his behalf. And I don't know if I have enough distance yet from what the knowing feels like." He nodded. He did not argue. He did not rearrange his face to accommodate what she'd said. He simply received it, the way he had received everything she'd said in this room, with the stillness of a man who understands that he does not get to negotiate the terms of someone else's grief. "The document is yours regardless," he said. "It's not payment for forgiveness. There isn't enough in the world to pay for forgiveness, and I know that. It's," he searched for the word, "acknowledgement," he said. "The only form of acknowledgement I have to offer." She sat with this for a moment. Then she thought about something else, something that had been sitting in the back of her mind for 3 weeks, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to come forward. She thought about Sofia on the floor of the playroom, handing a blue block to the most feared man in the city, saying building is more fun with 2 people. She thought about what Sofia knew that neither of them did, that the falling is not the end, that the fallen tower is just tomorrow's beginning, that you hold out the blue block not because the other person has earned it, but because the building itself is the point. "My father used to say," Elena said slowly, "that bread is the proof that something broken can be made whole." She paused. "Flour is just grain. Grain is just a seed. You grind it down to nothing and then you add water and heat and time, and you get something you couldn't have made from the original. Something different. Something that feeds people." Dante looked at her. She looked at the document in her hands. She thought about her daughter eating dinner in the formal dining room on Tuesday evenings and insisting on butter and honey and being absolutely certain she was right and the world agreeing with her. She thought about a tower of colored blocks not falling for a very long time. "I won't open it where it was," she said. "I won't try to go back. That's gone, and trying to pretend it isn't is its own kind of lie." She looked up. "But I'll open it somewhere. I'll make it something of mine and Sofia's. I'll make it new." She folded the document carefully. "That's not forgiveness. I want you to understand that." "I understand," he said. "But it's not nothing either," she said. He looked at his hands one more time. Then he looked out the window at the garden. The same window, the same garden, the city lights beginning to come on in the distance as evening arrived, and something in his face settled into a different configuration. Not peace, exactly. Not resolution. but something in the neighborhood of those things. Something that had been absent from it for a very long time. "No," he said quietly. "It's not nothing." Sofia came to find her mother that evening in the servants' wing, having escaped the housekeeper's supervision through the exercise of what was apparently considerable diplomatic skill for a 4-year-old, and burst through the door of Elena's room with her arms already open and her face radiant with the specific joy of a child who has been waiting all day to do exactly this. Elena caught her. She held her. She pressed her mouth to the top of those dark curls and breathed in lavender and biscuits and the warm particular smell of her daughter's head, and she thought about her father's hands and her mother's folded hands and 20 years of grief without a name, and she thought about flour ground from grain ground from seed, and about the particular alchemy of broken things made whole in forms you couldn't have predicted from the beginning. "What we doing tomorrow, Mama?" Sofia asked, her voice muffled against Elena's shoulder. Elena held her daughter in the small warm room and thought about a property document in an envelope on a desk and a street she knew and an empty space that had once been a bakery and might be one again. Different, new. Hers. "We're going to look at something," she said. "What's something?" "A place," she said. "A place where we might build something." Sofia pulled back and looked at her mother with those enormous eyes, and her face broke open into the particular radiant smile that Elena had decided, long ago, was the most important thing in the world, the smile that contained no history of loss, no memory of demolished buildings or hollow fathers or 3 words in a ledger, nothing but the pure animal joy of a child who has been told that something is about to begin. "Building," Sofia said happily, "is the best." And somewhere in the mansion, in the study on the 2nd floor, a dark green ledger sat closed on its desk, and the man who had written in it for 20 years sat with his hands folded and the city lights spread out beyond the window like a second sky, and felt, with a rawness that was almost unbearable and also, undeniably, the first real thing he had felt in years, the exact and specific weight of what it costs to see yourself clearly. Outside, somewhere in the night garden, the bird was singing, and the sound of it, this time, did not belong to grief.